My name is Jenna Spinelli. I am the communication specialist for the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. Thank you to our colleagues at Penn State Law for helping to get the word out about this event on short notice, and to everybody else who helped us spread the word on social media and otherwise. I'm excited to be joined today by Michael Nelson, the Jeffrey L. Hyde and Sharon D. Hyde and Political Science Board of Visitors early career professor in political science and an affiliate faculty member at Penn State Law. He specializes in American politics, state politics, and judicial politics, and his research examines the effect of judicial elections and public support for the courts and the rule of law in the US and abroad, and the effects of collegiality on judicial behavior. So no shortage of things to talk about there. So Michael, thank you for taking the time to do this today. And as you all have questions, which I'm sure you do, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. I'll be collecting them and sending them back to Michael throughout the events today. I did get a couple in advance that we will get to as well, but over the next couple of minutes while we do some introductory questions here, feel free to go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A box. We are also recording this as well if you need to duck out early or want to share the link with anybody after the fact. But you know, as a way to get into this, Michael, we hear a lot in the media, and I think just as we talk about some of these issues about, you know, the term courts are kind of used interchangeably. Sometimes we're talking about state court, sometimes we're talking about the Supreme Court, sometimes it's a federal court or an appellate court. So can you set the stage for us about which courts have jurisdiction over election-related claims and how the workflow, for lack of a better term, kind of proceeds from there?
That's a great question because it's really confusing. So each of the 50 states and DC has its own court system. It has its own trial courts, its own Supreme Court that make their own decisions based on that state's constitution. So if you get pulled over for speeding, or you and your spouse go for a divorce, that's going to happen in state court. There's also the US federal system, and they have jurisdiction over things that relate to federal law. So those are the US federal district courts, the US courts of appeals, and the US Supreme Court. What makes election law a little bit confusing is that it's one of the areas of law that is enshrined both in state constitutions and in the US Constitution. So 49 of the 50 state constitutions have some clause in them that relate to free and fair state elections. And then there are also provisions in the US Constitution about things like the Electoral College and how we pick the president and senators. So what's happening in a lot of these cases is that people are filing claims both in the state courts under the state constitution, but also to the US Supreme Court or to their local circuit court, claiming that something happened in violation of the federal constitution. The important principle, sorry, one more thing. The important principle is that state courts, so long as they're just interpreting the state constitution, have final word there. But as soon as they kind of step into something that relates to federal law, the US Supreme Court can step in and overturn them. And that's really important with what's happening right now.
Yeah, so is this a both and kind of scenario where someone might file the same claim or different versions of the same claim in state court and in federal court?
Yeah, so that's what we've seen right now in Pennsylvania. If you followed the news much, the court case that we've heard the most about relates to something that happened in Pennsylvania. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, so the state court, said that under the Pennsylvania Constitution, it was okay for Pennsylvania to count ballots that were sent by election day, but came in by the end of the week. The Trump campaign filed suit, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, no, that's fine. The Trump administration then appealed that to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court said basically, we're not going to rule on that right now. Some of the justices said that they think maybe there were problems with that ruling, and it seems like the Trump campaign might go back to the U.S. Supreme Court. But that's an example of a case that's happened both in the state courts and in the federal courts.
And so is it the case then that a federal court can override a state court decision?
Yeah, so they can. So the kind of the most famous election law example of this is Bush versus Gore. So the Florida Supreme Court ruled, then the U.S. Supreme Court came in, and the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling was the one that stood. What's unique about this Pennsylvania case is that the Supreme Court would be coming in and saying that the Pennsylvania court didn't have the power to rule in the case that it did, and that would be a pretty dramatic change for how election law works. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and these times that the Supreme Court has intervened, it seems like it happens so quickly. Like some cases take years to get to the Supreme Court. So how is it that these election things are able to seemingly get through in a matter of days, if not less?
Yeah, so the best job to have in the country is to be a U.S. Supreme Court justice, because you get to pick which cases you decide, you get to pick how many cases you decide, and you get to pick how quickly you want to do them. So what happens in these election law cases is that the Supreme Court says, okay, because there's a national interest in getting this sorted out quickly, are going to push everything else aside and will rule on this quickly. So normally they'll decide to hear a case, and then 6 months later they'll hear oral argument. In an election law case, if they want to hear oral arguments on Monday, they could do that. Wow.
So, no pressure for the people filing these things, right? They have to kind of hurry up and get everything ready.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And the campaigns have had legal teams working, kind of getting things ready in anticipation of different things that could happen, so that, if they needed to file a lawsuit, they've got drafts ready to go and they can just get them sent.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier the case about how long ballots could be accepted in Pennsylvania. I know that the Trump campaign has filed several other suits specifically in Pennsylvania. Can you bring us up to speed on what those have been?
Yeah, so the one that the campaign won yesterday dealt with election observers. So whenever ballots are being counted, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party can have people in the room, and do have people in the room, to make sure that all the rules are being filed. Philly said that because of COVID, they wanted those observers to be 20 feet or so away from the ballots being counted. The Trump campaign said, that's so far away that you can't see what's on the ballot, and the judge agreed there. There have also been some cases about whether or not counties could tell the parties if somebody had mailed in their ballot and there was a problem with that ballot, so it couldn't be counted, if they could give that information to the parties so they could contact those voters to get those things fixed. And those have been kind of the two biggest. So kind of watching the count, and then whether it's okay to release information so ballots can be cured, which means they can be counted.
Right. So, this election is so unusual in many ways. And, I'm wondering what do we know about, to the extent to which these judges, when they're making these rulings, are thinking about what's happening in this current moment versus what precedent they might be setting up moving forward?
Yeah, I was talking to some of my friends who've worked as clerks to federal judges, and they were all saying that federal judges really hate election law cases, both because they come in and totally disrupt whatever you were working on, but also judges, like everybody else in a democracy, takes the electoral process really seriously, and it's a pretty big move for judges to come in and invalidate votes. And so judges are pretty reluctant to intervene in the electoral process as a general rule, particularly after people have already voted. And so, for example, one major thing the Supreme Court will consider if they decide to hear this case about whether or not to count the ballots that came in after Election Day is the fact that what they call a reliance interest happened. Voters, normal people, cast their ballot under the rules, and the rules said that so long as you postmarked your ballot by Election Day, it would be counted. And for a bunch of unelected judges to come in and say, nope, we're not going to count those, particularly after we have some information about who's winning and who's losing, is the sort of thing that could be really harmful to people's trust in the democratic process and the courts.
Right. Yeah, and there's also this kind of, you brought up Bush v. Gore before, and in what ways, if any, is the kind of shadow of that hanging over this process?
Yes, so I think it's huge. And on the one hand, it was such an important case because it was so controversial for the court to step in and resolve it so quickly. The other thing that makes it really unique, that when people kind of wonder, is there going to be a Trump v. Biden case this year, is that case was so important because the Florida votes were decisive. Whoever won Florida was going to win the presidency. And right now, with there being so many states in play, it doesn't seem like, for example, whether or not we count these ballots that came in over a 3-day period in Pennsylvania is going to be the difference between a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency. And that's exactly the sort of thing where it's really nice to be a Supreme Court justice, where you don't have to hear anything you don't want to, because they can totally just say, we're not gonna involve ourselves with this, and there's nothing that either campaign can do.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the case this time. But to that point about precedent, that might not be the case the next time something like this happens, or there's kind of a similar situation.
Absolutely. I think that in general, courts are reluctant to get involved in cases about counting votes after the vote counting has already started. There are all kinds of election law cases that pop up when we're allocating voters to districts, right? So we hear about gerrymandering all the time, and the Supreme Court ruling on gerrymandering. There were a ton of cases that came before the courts in October about when ballots could be accepted, what sort of COVID-related precautions were appropriate. But the sort of Bush v. Gore case where something's happening after the ballots are being counted is pretty rare for it to make it all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and we also know that over the past 4 years that the Trump administration has appointed a lot of judges at the federal level, and there's been lots of talk about how partisan those judges might be, and these sorts of things. Is there any reason to think that precedent of not interfering in these cases would change because of how the makeup of some of these judges has changed over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think so. But it's in some ways it's kind of difficult to know how, because on the one hand, presidents have done a much better job over the last 2 or 3 decades about picking judges that have the same general policy views as they do. And so, it's likely the case that most judges that Trump appointed, all things equal, would prefer Trump to be reelected over Biden. At the same time, these people have jobs for life, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And it's a real good look to the public for them to look at the president that appointed them and say, no, not today. It makes them look independent. It makes them look strong. All things that judges really like. So it puts them in kind of a weird position where, on the one hand, personally, they might like one candidate more than the other, the person who appointed them. but they also don't want to look like they're under that person's control.
Right, and I mean, obviously, they're not susceptible to kind of the public's whim the way that a president or member of Congress or pretty much any other person involved in government office might be.
Absolutely.
Related to that, we had a question come in here about the Supreme Court in particular. Can they be trusted to make a non-political decision, and how does that maybe compare to courts of the past?
Yeah, I think it's so hard when a case like this comes up, because by the time any case makes its way to the Supreme Court, it's there by definition because it's a tough case. The Supreme Court rarely chooses to hear cases where the law is super clean cut. They're hearing cases where there are good arguments on both sides. And it's certainly the case that the justices on the court right now tend to be more conservative than say the court 10 years ago. And that's a function of President Trump, successfully being able to fill 3 seats on the court. At the same time, especially like with this Pennsylvania case, with this idea of the reliance interest and the fact that people had already voted, we saw a similar case in Texas last week, and the judge who heard that was one of the most conservative judges in the country. And he took one look at that case and said, these people, there were rules about how they could vote. They followed the rules, and no way you're going to have me invalidate over 100,000 votes. And I think, that's the same sort of thing that we'd likely see at the Supreme Court, in that they're going to weigh that heavily, even if that doesn't come out in favor of the candidate that aligns with them most ideologically.
Right. So the other thing kind of on the table here, and it seems like one strategy in the Trump campaign's playbook is this notion of recounts, calling for recounts. And I believe, if I understood correctly, the Secretary of State in Georgia has said that there either is or is likely going to be a recount. So can you tell us how that process works and to what extent the courts might play in it?
Yes. So every state sets its own rules for when a recount can happen. Arizona has a really strict rule. So recounts only happen if you're within 1/10 of 1%, up to Wisconsin, which allows recounts so long as you're within 1%. The 2 candidates are within 1%. They also vary on who funds it. So in Nevada, you can request a recount. You just have to pay up front for how much it would cost to recount all those ballots. And if it turns out they were wrong, then they'll pay you back. It seems likely that we'll have a recount in Wisconsin. The Trump campaign has said they want one there. It sounds like it's likely, with Georgia being so close, that we'll get a recount there. At the same time, Wisconsin's had a couple of recounts in the last decade or so, and it's only changed the vote count by like 200 or 300 votes. And so right now, assuming that's kind of what's typical, we don't have any states that are that close. It could be the case that when they look through, they find that somebody had entered the numbers wrong or something, but the states do that anyway. So they get a count out quickly, and then they go back and it's called a canvass, where they go back through and make sure that everything was counted correctly. And that's why, if you looked at the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's website today, and you go back a month from now, all the counties' numbers will be different by like 20 votes, because they, some vote, just little things happen. So it's likely that we'll see some recounts, and they'll play out for a long time, but it's unlikely that a recount would would flip in
Yeah.
80 states right now.
So, it seems that some of these cases, as you said, that the Trump campaign is filing in various states, don't seem to be gaining much traction. And so there's, I think, maybe some speculation, some questions about whether they might shift more to a strategy of trying to try to influence the electoral college process and how electors do their work. I know that there was a case about this over the summer, right? The
Yes.
faithless electors case. We have a couple of questions about this in the Q&A, but can you remind us about faithless electors before we get to them?
Yes. So if we go all the way back, right, each state gets a number of electors that's equal to the number of people they have in the House of Representatives plus the number of senators, so plus 2. And when you vote on election day, you're not actually voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. You're actually voting for the Pennsylvania Democratic Party's slate of electors or the Republican Party of Pennsylvania's slate of electors. And those, based on whoever wins, those are the people that actually vote, and they vote in the states in the middle of December. One question that has come up kind of repeatedly is that sometimes the electors don't vote for the people they're supposed to. So in the 2000 election, for example, Al Gore got one less elector than it looked like he was going to because somebody refused to cast a vote. So a bunch of states have laws that say if you're a Republican elector and the Republican candidate wins your state, you have to vote for that person. So the question before the Supreme Court was, can you do that? And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, you can. So right now, 33 states have laws that say, if you are bound, then you have to vote, or you can be charged with a crime or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is possible that if these electors are from a state that doesn't have a law like that they can vote their conscience. At the same time, it's pretty unlikely because remember that these people are chosen by the party. So like the Pennsylvania Republican Party picked a slate of electors that, it's an honor to be chosen, that they think will definitely cast ballots for Donald Trump. The Democrats did the same thing. And so it would be pretty wild for them to get to December and have a bunch of electors just flip to the other party.
Yeah. And is there any way for a campaign to challenge any of this or try to stall this process in any way using the courts?
Not really. So this is a part that's pretty clear in the Constitution, and part of the whole reason Bush v. Gore happened so quickly is that there's a date a week before the electors vote, so like the end of the first week in December, where like you basically have to lock in who won your state. And when Bush v. Gore happened, the Florida recounts were coming right up to that deadline. And so part of the reason they wanted to stop the count was so they didn't hit that deadline. So for that reason, it's pretty unlikely that they'd successfully be able to move it back.
Yeah. To borrow a line from our colleague Candace Watt-Smith, we're all learning so much about the intricacies of these government processes this year and over the past couple of years, things that we never really had reason to learn about otherwise, but the more you know, and kind of getting an insight into all these intricacies. So, and is there any basis kind of related to electors, not necessarily to courts, but is there any basis for a state legislature to change how electors are selected after the election?
Yes. So this is a great question because this has come up. As Candace's statement is so apt, when you take like Intro to American Government, we cover the Electoral College in like 10 minutes in lecture, And like the one fun fact you learn is that if there's a tie, the House of Representatives votes. And now it's like we are so far down into the weeds of what's in the bottom of some of these amendments. But the short answer here is that yes, the state legislatures have the option of appointing electors if the state didn't make a decision. That's a really high bar because every state has had an election, and we're not going to have like a state exactly tie or something. It hasn't really been litigated what it would look like if a state hadn't made a decision. But that's the contingency that's in the Constitution. We're starting to see a lot of state legislative leaders, this has happened in Pennsylvania, come out and say, we are absolutely not going to touch that. So I think, it's unlikely that we're going to see it litigated, but there is, a provision that they could do that, but not likely.
Yeah. And it's also, we have a question here saying it's been reported that the state legislature can decide election results are tainted, overrule the popular vote, and create a slate of electors of the non-winning party. Is that accurate? Can something like that happen?
Yeah, so that's the same sort of thing. The big picture idea here is that in the federal Constitution, state legislators and state legislatures are the ultimate arbiter of a state's election. And so they have the ability to choose the procedures under which something happens. I think, for a state legislature, kind of practically to come in and say that the electoral process, which by definition they put in play under the Constitution, they so massively did a poor job of regulating it so that it was full of fraud, would be unbelievable, I think, to see in practice. The other thing to kind of think about with electoral fraud is that elections in the US are really decentralized, right? So, you on election day show up at a polling place. That polling place has equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans working. When I voted in Missouri here on Tuesday, a Democrat had to sign the top of my ballot and a Republican had to sign the top of my ballot before they could hand it to me. There was a Democrat and a Republican standing at the box when I put it in. They're going to take it to be counted, and all these counts happen by your local election official. So for there to be kind of widespread fraud of the sort that you would need to flip an election, it would be pretty remarkable coordination that you would need to get all of these people from both parties who are watching all the time to work. And that's why empirically we don't see that much fraud.
Right. Yeah, and to that point on watchers, I mean, what are people watching for when they're kind of at these counting places or polling places? Like what types of things are they on the lookout for?
So, some of it's just mundane, right? So like when you're counting the votes, you've got a stack of ballots and you're running them through the machine, and you're looking to make sure that they only stick one in at a time, that if the machine gets jammed, no ballot gets scanned twice. Literally in Iowa, the poll watchers had been using too much hand sanitizer, and so there was residual hand sanitizer residue on the ballots that was gunking up the machine. So they have to watch to make sure that, when they clean the machine, nobody takes ballots out and rescans them. Then they're also looking when the machine rejects a ballot. So, it's the machine says, I'm not sure who voted. A Democrat and a Republican observer will both look to make sure that they're in agreement about the voter's intent being served as that ballot being counted.
Man, some of this is bringing back like memories of the before times when we were all in the office and the printer would jam and like thinking about some of those kind of things. But I guess it's all kind of the same technology. It all happens. Uh,
Absolutely.
uh. So there's a question here about curing, and I'm going to try to condense it a little bit. Hopefully, I can still get the meaning of it here. So, basically, this person is asking: is there legal standing for not counting ballots? In some states, the recorders must make a reasonable effort to contact people who messed up their signatures or these types of things, but where is the oversight to ensure that that reasonable effort is made?
So that's a good question. I think generally what happens so this is one of these things that varies by state. I think probably generally the state secretary of state or whoever that is going to set procedures for how those people should be contacted, and then will rely on local election officials to carry that out. Local election officials, like any local politician, have lots of discretion about what they do. And so, I think it's probably pretty unlikely that somebody in the state capitol is gonna double check to make sure that everybody had been reached out to. And that's also why on social media, you see a lot of postings, telling people to make sure that their ballot got counted, to make sure that there weren't problems with that. And if there were, they can go to their election office and cure that ballot to make sure it gets counted.
Mhm. And similar to that, we have a question here about what should people do if they received a ballot in the mail, but they did not request one?
Oh, yes, that's a good question. So, at this stage, you probably destroy it. Um, certainly you can't cast a ballot now. I know that it seemed that in Center County, I know some friends of mine got ballots in the mail and they hadn't received them. And so, people were able to vote that way. But if you have a spare ballot, you can frame it, you can throw it away. There's nothing special about it now.
Yeah. So, this is all going to sort itself out. I mean, it might take more time or not, depending on how things go. But will there be like what comes next after this? Is there any way, like any effort by the courts or by people in the campaigns or the parties to kind of take a look back and say, okay, these are all the things that we changed, all the things that we challenged. How do we make sure that we have a firm foundation for the next election and moving forward?
So that's a great question. I saw an exchange on Twitter yesterday, actually, with Jeb Bush, who was the governor of Florida for a while, and people were wondering, why is it that by 9 p.m. on election night, Florida was like counted, and today Nevada has way less people than Florida does, and we're still waiting on them to count ballots in Nevada. And Jeb Bush's answer was, well, after Bush v. Gore, we invested a bunch of money into upgrading technology and making sure that we had systems in place to make sure that ballots could be counted quickly. In Pennsylvania and in some of the other states, the state legislatures declined to allow local election officials to start counting mail ballots early. So I think we'll start to see some states think about whether or not that's something they want to do in the future to try to, wrap this up quickly. But part of the problem or feature, depending on, maybe you really like that this drug out for 4 days, is that because the Constitution gives the power to the individual states, it's really difficult for the federal government to force the states to do anything. They kind of, can pick the route that they want. So I expect we'll see some discussion about it, but in a lot of these states, the machinery for these elections is pretty old, and we'll see whether or not states want to invest in making things move a little more quickly.
Right. But the federal government could incentivize states with funding, right, to help modernize their systems, or to I guess you tell me, how far can the federal government go in terms of what it incentivizes or not?
Totally. Yeah, the federal government could provide the states some money to invest in new equipment, new voting machines. When I was in grad school, I voted, and the poor election official had a Palm Pilot. Like, I hadn't seen one of these in like 15 years, and they were like trying to find my name in the Palm Pilot, and then they couldn't, and then they had like a BlackBerry, the old BlackBerry, to try to like look up my name. It's because this stuff is only used a couple days a year, it's easy for states to kind of let it go by the wayside. But I think particularly now, as technology gets more sophisticated, it's going to be more important for states to make sure that the electronic systems that they're using are robust to being hacked and things like that. And that's going to make states a little more interested in spending some funds to make sure that their systems are safe.
Sure. Question here in the Q&A: can any citizen go and watch ballots being counted? What's the process to be a ballot watcher? Maybe not for this year, since it seems like we're almost done,
right,
but for the future.
So I think it varies. I think generally the people who count ballots would probably be flattered that you as a citizen are interested in watching it be done. Certainly it's the case that a lot of local candidates are kind of milling about at the county courthouse, waiting to hear whether or not they won. And you can go online right now. This city of Philadelphia is live streaming their votes. I think a lot of local election officials want people to come and watch because they want you to feel like your vote is being counted and that's happening in a fair process. It was a little difficult this year with the pandemic, trying to make sure that all this could be done safely. But generally in a non-pandemic world, yeah, you can probably just show up and they'll be more than happy to tell you way more than you ever cared to know.
Yeah, no, they I believe Center County broadcast as well. They're counting. They rented out a room in the Penn Stater, and we're doing it all over there. But so in regard to reporting, do you think that counties or states should have the right to wait to report their numbers, barring results from other states?
This is something that probably the state legislature could decide. Certainly we saw in Pennsylvania some counties decide to wait until Wednesday to start counting some of their votes. I think it would be a tricky thing to do because I think citizens generally want to know who's going to represent them. And so for a state to say that they were going to hold those results would make citizens a little wary. Like I said before, it's really important to these elections officials that everything's done as transparently as possible. And so, holding ballots, I think would worry some people. But nothing comes to mind that it's definitely against something in the Constitution or something.
Yeah, it goes to that issue of legitimacy, right? People trusting in the process, and yeah, I think that's something, as you said, that elected officials and also the courts are very concerned about too. That people trust what they do, and I know that you've been involved with some research on this about how trusting people are of the courts. How has that changed over the past couple of years, and how do you think what we're seeing now might impact that moving forward?
It's a great question. So the kind of two main takeaways of this research I've done on how people feel about the Supreme Court is, first, that process really matters. So, people understand that if Donald Trump is going to get to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, then Donald Trump's going to appoint justices to the Supreme Court that have similar policy views to what he has. And, in the same way that you or me or anybody has positions about abortion or same-sex marriage or these sorts of things, of course the justices do, right? They're people. And, so long as the process that the courts are using is a fair and open one, people are pretty much okay if the court doesn't decide cases in the way that they like. What the people really don't like, and what just kills public support for the court, is an idea that the court's being political in its decisions. So, like, it's well and fine for people to vote their sincerely held beliefs, but if you're playing this political game, that makes people really distrust the court. And so that's part of why I think the court's going to be really reluctant to hear a big election case unless they absolutely have to, because it's the sort of case that's going to turn a bunch of people off, because no matter how they decide the case, half of the country is going to be really mad at them, and you can't please everybody at once.
Yeah, and I was talking with Rachel Sheldon, who runs the Richard Center here at Penn State, is kind of an expert on the courts of the Civil War era, and she says that the court has always been political, but the court has more. The difference is that the court has more power now than it did before. Can you talk about what that shift looks like, or how the court is more powerful today than in decades or years past?
Definitely. So, so part of it is just like in the Constitution. If you open up the Constitution, they spend pages and pages and pages on Congress, and then they the only thing they say in the Constitution about the Supreme Court is that it exists and it has a Chief Justice, and Congress is going to fill in the details. Then when they first started to fill the court, they literally couldn't get people to agree to be Supreme Court justices because everybody thought it was way more important to be a state Supreme Court judge. And that was because everybody thought that the Constitution limited the federal government's power a lot and left most of the power to the states. In the past 250 years, we've seen the federal government's power get bigger and bigger. And so more and more things now are under the Supreme Court's purview. As a result, they have a lot more power. And so now, all things equal, most people would rather be a Supreme Court justice than a Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice.
Yeah. Question here. This person says, currently in Pennsylvania, there are 2 rural counties that have decided that they're not going to count any ballots that arrived after Tuesday, even though they were postmarked before November 3rd. Can they do that? So,
probably in terms of not counting them today, probably nothing's gonna happen because the Secretary of State told counties to separate the ballots that they had by the end of election night and the ballots that came in later. Right now, the Supreme Court say the state of play is that all of those ballots are going to be counted, but it seems likely that there's going to be some litigation. And so, I could see a county saying, we have them, we're going to keep them safe, but we're not going to report them out until we know whether or not they're going to count to avoid misleading the public. But unless something changes, they're going to eventually have to count those votes. The Secretary of State will demand that. But for now, because they were forced to segregate it, that's probably why they're waiting. They're waiting for inspection.
So follow up to what you were saying about the Supreme Court. isn't it the court's job to decide a case based on an interpretation of the Constitution? Their personal opinion might come into play, but there's a legal argument that it should take precedent over that.
Absolutely, absolutely. The thing that makes it hard is like what I said earlier, that by the time a case makes its way to the Supreme Court, it's made it there because there are good arguments on both sides. And in fact, the best predictor of whether or not a particular case is going to be heard by the Supreme Court is whether or not two lower courts heard the same issue and disagreed. So an example that I use in class, there were a bunch of cases where Congress had passed a law and it said, if you commit a crime using a firearm, then you get sentenced to extra time in jail. And there were several cases where somebody like robbed a bank, but they kept the gun in their pocket. So nobody ever saw that they had a gun, but they used it in that they had it with them when they committed the crime. So had they used the gun, had they not used the gun, courts disagreed. And that's the sort of ambiguity, right? You can imagine that happening, making a good argument in either way. And that's where justices have some kind of discretion.
So a couple more questions here. We have maybe about 10 minutes or so left. If you have anything that you have not put in the Q&A, now would be a great time to do that. So we might have already touched on this, but just in case, since each state sets its own timeline, is it correct that no other entity can challenge the legitimacy of counting votes as long as it's done by that stated timeline?
Yes. So within each state, the state's own procedures govern what's happening unless somebody alleges that they violated the US Constitution, and then the federal courts are going to weigh in. But for example, it's difficult for like Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell to come in and do anything about how quickly Pennsylvania or Georgia or Nevada is counting votes. It's one of those like federalism 101 things. There are some things that the federal government just can't touch.
And so, this one might sound kind of morbid, but as a result of all the early voting and mail-in ballots, have you heard anything about any checks and balances in place to ensure that people that cast mail-in votes or voted early were still living on election day? And I guess, is that even the standard to think about, or how should we think about this unfortunate issue?
Yeah, so this comes up all the time. Somebody was elected, I think, to the North Dakota State Legislature on Tuesday who died. So like between, this happens, it seems like it happens in every election cycle to like one or two candidates. The ballots get printed, somebody passes away, and then they get elected to office because they can't reprint all the ballots. The same thing happens with voters. So I read a story about a woman who was in a nursing home. She was really excited to vote. She cast her ballot, and then she passed away. And they'll look through. Usually, what they do is look through recent obituaries and things. Compare that to state death records. Compare that to the list of ballots, and then they'll discard those votes.
Yeah, but again, in the grand scheme of things, these probably are not high enough numbers to really influence a state's election result one way or the other.
Right. These are the sorts of things when I was talking earlier about there's the initial count and then there's the canvas, and things will shift around by 20 votes or so. This is the sort of thing that they're doing. They election night's over, they have a little bit of time to go back and cross-check things, and that's the sort of thing they'll do.
Yeah, although maybe there are some political scientists out there that are kind of eagerly waiting for the data to come out this year so they can compare it to how it's happened in the past. How much of an impact did mail-in ballots have on these types of discrepancies and those kind of things?
Absolutely.
So, you know, the other thing that's coming up as we head into 2021 is redistricting, and it's going to bring about conversations on gerrymandering. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit here, but there was a question in the chat about, can you help us understand why the Supreme Court decided that it couldn't rule on racial gerrymandering?
Yes. So every 10 years, we have a census. After that census, they determine how many representatives each state is going to have. And then each state's legislature decides which geographic areas get put into which districts. So we call that redistricting. And this process of gerrymandering is you're trying to draw the lines in ways that are favorable to you. And the Supreme Court has generally been reluctant to impose too much onto what the states do. So, you know, there were lots of questions, particularly now that we have really powerful computers. You can load in some information about how people voted in the last couple of elections and push a button, and the computer can draw the absolute best set of maps that will optimize the number of Republican representatives or the number of Democratic representatives. And so people have been trying to get the Supreme Court to say, you know, no, you can't do that. And the court's been kind of reluctant to do that. What they have done, though, particularly with respect to race, is allowed what they call majority minority districts. So they call it packing. You know, so if you have a district and it's a predominantly African American district, to make sure that there's some descriptive representation, that not all of the representatives from that area are white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can do another Q&A with you or others about gerrymandering and redistricting as we head into the next couple of months here. Just checking the chat one more time. So another kind of succession or chain of power question here. So there's a long 2-month period between election and inauguration day. We're also in the midst of a pandemic. What if something happens to the president-elect? Does it go to the vice president-elect, or what's the order of operations there?
That's a good question. My guess, but I am not 100% sure on that particular one. I believe it goes to the vice president, but I could be wrong on that. That's one of those, like Candace said, we're all learning so much.
Yeah.
I believe that would be the case.
Yeah.
But I could be wrong there.
Yeah.
The U.S. is rare worldwide in this long transition period. You know, in most countries, you finish the election and the people get sworn in a few days later. This long transition period is, you know, it made a lot of sense when you physically had to ride a horse from Georgia to Philadelphia, but is a little antiquated now.
Yeah, there's a lot of things like that, it seems, and you know, I guess I wonder, do you see any prospects for reforming some of these processes, or is it just it's going to be the way that it's going to be because that's the way that it's always been?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there are always proposals to reform the Electoral College, but like so many institutions, it benefits some people and doesn't benefit other people, and those two groups kind of cancel themselves out. So I expect that we're going to continue to hear about it, but because it's in the Constitution, it would require a constitutional amendment, and right now it doesn't look like there's enough momentum for that to happen soon. But I definitely expect that we're going to see more and more people try to get that momentum started. Right.
Let me see if there's anything else here. So I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions in the Q&A, unfortunately, but we'll maybe end. Well, we'll end with one from the Q&A. Then I have one final one for you. So, we've seen also over the past couple of days different networks calling some states before others. I know you're not a media scholar, but can you tell us how what is the data they're looking at, and why might there be the option to even have different standards
Yes.
across networks and things like that?
So the first thing to know about these network decision desks, they're called, is that they're completely independent of everything else. So like the head of the NBC News decision desk is actually a political science professor at Penn. And so they operate in their own bubble, and they make the decisions about whether or not states are going to be called, not the reporters, not the anchors. And that independence is really important. They're using a combination of exit poll data and ballots, ballot data as it comes in, as well as historical information. So, it could be the case that a bunch of ballots are still left to be counted, but we know they're from areas that have always voted Republican. And so based on that and polling and everything, we're really confident that that state's gonna go for Donald Trump. And so we can call West Virginia the minute polls close there. The reason they differ is that you've got a bunch of different people working, and they're gonna have different thresholds for how certain they are. And so, it's pretty rare that they have to walk them back. It happens, but they happen at different times, mainly because people have different levels of certainty.
Yeah, and it seems like, I've seen some conversation on Twitter about maybe they're more gun shy this year because of what's happened in Bush v. Gore and other cases about calling things too soon. Has that been your sense as well?
I think it's more that with these last few states, they're genuinely hard, and the ballots are coming in so slowly that they don't know for sure, coupled with the fact that because the group of people who voted by mail, and so they're the last set of ballots to be counted, looks different than any other year because of the pandemic. And so, whereas in a normal year, they could be pretty confident what those ballots look like, they're not certain what that group of people look like because the pandemic made a bunch of different types of people vote early. So they just really don't want to be wrong on the last state. That would be catastrophic. So I think that's more.
Great. So we are just about at 4 o'clock here. One last question, but before we let you go, Michael. So, what are you watching for over the next couple of days, weeks? I think as we've discussed, the Trump campaign likes litigation. They like to bring these cases. But the Biden campaign also has its own army of lawyers at the ready. And what types of things are you going to be looking for, and what should we all be keeping our eyes on here as this all unfolds?
I think that the most important thing to be watching for is evidence. So we're going to hear lots of claims of fraud or procedures not being followed, and anybody can make those claims, anybody can tweet that out. But what the courts are going to look for is some evidence that this happened. And we're pretty lucky to live in a pretty technologically advanced time where there are going to be video cameras in most of these places. Everybody has a cell phone, and so if they saw something, they can get their phone out and take a picture or a video. And so I would say the most important thing to be watching for as we're kind of navigating this is looking at what evidence people have of what's happening. I think the other kind of bigger picture is just patience with, particularly Georgia and Arizona. the races are going to be pretty close, and it's going to take time. And you know, we're wired to want to know really quick, but it's an important and serious process, and doing it right takes time. And that's an unfortunate truth about this stuff.
Great. Well, Michael, this has been wonderful. Thank you for taking the time and for answering questions on the courts and beyond. It was really great to have this refresher and to expand our understanding today. Thank you to everybody who tuned in today. Great questions. And yeah, have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jenna.